All right, folks. So let's go ahead and finish what we're doing. So now we're going to be on the New Deal programs. And basically what we're looking at is we're going to look at how they affected our economy, did they work, did they not work to get us out of the Great Depression. So remember, the major New Deal programs, there were a lot of them back then. And some of them are still with us today. So we had the relief program part of the New Deal, the recovery part, and the reform part. And so these are the New Deal programs for you to look at. Some of the major ones were the Social Security Act that created unemployment insurance, retiree pensions, disability insurance for people that are disabled and can't work, and aid to poor children. And then you have the Tennessee Valley Authority that developed projects and infrastructure like dams that were built to bring electricity and flood control to the Tennessee River Valley in parts of Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama. And then you have the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that is still around today, that insures your bank deposits, money that you put into the bank, that if the bank closes down or becomes bankrupt, that's where they got that name from, then you're insured to get your money back or most of your money back. Okay. Then the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, regulates the stock market. All right, FDR's alphabet soup. So the New Deal programs were known as, some people, as alphabet soup because they were acronyms, right? Like CCC, WPA, SSA, AAA, TVA. They all stood for something. All right, so basically, you had your Civilian Conservation Corps, your Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and so on and so on. So this became known as alphabet soup. If you're familiar at all with alphabet soup, it's pretty good. It's like tomato based. Anyway, so this is what his programs were known as. And here was his wife, the president's wife, right here, the first lady. So reaching out to the American people. So the first lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, traveled on behalf of the president, Franklin. She was his eyes and his ears. So President Roosevelt had these fireside chats. So you can see this picture right here. So these kids in this family are all in their living room or their den or their house, and they're listening to the radio. So back then they didn't really have TVs. They had radios. They had radio programs instead of TV programs. So this family is probably listening, possibly to a fireside chat. So these were speeches given by radio address from the President FDR, to the American people, keeping the American people updated what was going on, what were some of his New Deal programs, how were they working, how were things going with the Great Depression, okay, how many people were becoming employed, and so on and so on. So some of the concerns about the New Deal. Not everybody supported the New Deal programs, especially some Republicans, because FDR was a Democrat, by the way. So policy of deficit spending more money than the government receives in revenue, and driving up the national debt like we do today. So FDR felt this was a necessary evil that had to be used to help fix the economic crisis that was going on. Okay, spending all this money on the New Deal programs he felt was necessary, even though it was costing the American government a lot of money and driving up the deficit or the debt. So it was supported by British economist John Maynard Keynes, and it was opposite of laissez-faire. Conservative opponents. So the American Liberty League said the New Deal violated rights of individuals and property. It added to the national debt because we were spending a lot of money on these New Deal programs, wasted money on relief, and encouraged idleness. Basically, people not working as much. So it gave the president too much power. That was the big thing. It gives the president too much power, or it gives the national federal government too much power. So these are some of the arguments against the New Deal programs. So the Revenue Act of 1935, let's look at three of them that are pretty important. The Revenue Act of 1935 raised federal income tax on higher income levels by introducing the wealth tax. So it was a progressive tax that took up to 75% of the highest incomes. So this meant that if you were rich and say you made over $1 million a year, then you were taxed more percentage-wise than a person that made, say, $40,000 a year. Okay, that's what a wealth tax means. So the wealthy pay higher percentage rates on taxes. So the Banking Act of 1935, FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act, which allowed the government to close all the banks and only open the ones that they thought were financially sound. This gave people confidence to use the banks again. All right, so they were starting to regulate banks, and they wanted only the banks that were economically sound, financially sound, to stay open. Okay, so remember at this time, about 50% or half of the banks around the country were going bankrupt or had closed down, and people were losing a lot of their money because back in those days, your money was not necessarily safe or insured. So if you put $100,000 in your bank account and your bank closed down, you might lose that $100,000. So the FDIC was made to ensure that people would get their money back if the bank closed down, which is a very, very good thing. Social Security Act of 1935 included provisions for unemployables, people that were like dependent children, the disabled, blind, unemployment insurance, and old age pensions. So these days we have Social Security for pension for people over the age of 65. So it passed in the second New Deal, most popular and longest lasting program that we still have around today, right? All right, WPA, which stands for Works Progress Administration. So it was mostly for young men that worked for the WPA. This was during the second New Deal, 1937. A lot of these young men were employed by the government directly, by the federal government, to build or improve schools, hospitals, playgrounds, and airports, among other things. They helped Public Works Administration to build bridges, dams, and overseas highways in all areas of the country. All right, so they built things that needed to be built anyway, and it also, the program employed a lot of young men so they could have money right in their pocket and not be unemployed. So the National Youth Administration, NYA, improved literacy and math skills in young people. Musicians were paid to perform in symphonies. Actors were paid to put on productions all over the country. Writers were paid to interview and write down firsthand accounts of history. Photographers capture images of history in the making. Okay, so again, this was a government program that paid people directly to do these things, so they cut down on the unemployment rate and to put money in the pockets of people. New Deal acts that were actually struck down. 1935 and 1936, the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA or AAA, was ruled unconstitutional. So the NIRA gives the president power to regulate businesses that operate within states. Okay, state-run businesses. So our Supreme Court rules that Congress cannot give presidents more power than the Constitution gives them, even during national emergencies. Right? So it limits the power of the president, what the president can do. All right. Protecting the New Deal. So if you look at this picture up here, Uncle Sam, which represents America, is looking down in astonishment as these people right here are Supreme Court justices, and this is FDR, the president, on the right. So protecting the New Deal, and in an attempt to protect the New Deal, President Roosevelt, FDR, tried to pack the Supreme Court. So this became known as the court packing plan, which proposed increasing the Supreme Court from 9 to 15 members, caused a revolt in the Democratic Party. Okay, would have allowed FDR to add 6 new justices, which would have likely voted for his New Deal programs, right? But this failed. So again, a court packing plan just means he's trying to pack the Supreme Court, which means he's trying to add more Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court so they would be in favor of him. And this is kind of, a lot of people didn't like this. A lot of people didn't like this at all. So it definitely was an unpopular thing that he was talking about. Extension of democracy. So what was the significance of the New Deal? What was the importance of the New Deal? So revelation of politics. So it strengthened the executive branch and the federal government as well a lot. The federal government grew a lot more powerful, and it had, it got a lot bigger because of the New Deal programs. It reasserted presidential leadership, revitalized the political party as a vehicle for the popular will and as an instrument for effective action. All right, so again, the main points of the New Deal is that it strengthened the executive branch, the president, the power of the president, okay? And it also made the federal government bigger as well, and more people depended on the federal government than ever during the 1930s and during the New Deal programs.